everybody. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube station at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and today I'm delighted to welcome Jesse Kalfel here. He's here to talk about his new novel, Paper Ghosts, a Fenn Cooper novel, which he describes as a love letter to the mystery thriller genre. Jesse's a resident of West Newbury. He's an author and a playwright. He's a recipient of 2 Hatch Awards from the New York State Council on the Arts and a grant recipient from the Massachusetts Council on the Arts. His previously published nonfiction book was So You're Cremated, Now What? He's also written option screenplays and writes and directs short plays which have been performed in Boston, Newburyport, and Manhattan. Jesse, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show to talk about Paper Ghosts.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Well, Jesse, let's start. I was hoping that you could tell us the meaning of your book's intriguing title, Paper Ghosts, and the role that it plays within your intricately plotted, suspenseful, and potentially deadly cat-and-mouse game pursued by the characters in this book.
Sure. Paper Ghosts refers to a long-forgotten contract that, if it's discovered, will bring big trouble to the person that was part of this, the inheriting basically the contract. And he has to go to extreme measures to find copies of the contract. And in doing so, not only does he have to hire somebody to find these contracts, but if anybody that he meets, the person that's going around to find these contracts, they could wind up in not a very good place.
Well,
so they're
yeah.
ghosts inherited in the contract that will haunt him if he does not find these copies of this long-forgotten contract.
Yes, and so much of the suspense thriller aspect hinges upon the finding of the paper ghosts and the implications that the finding of them will have for the fates of many of the characters. So it's a great setup. So,
and that's true. That is the setup for the whole book. Also, this book, a lot of mysteries are like whodunits.
Yeah.
And this is a why done it.
Yes.
Kind of a different take.
Yeah.
We know what happens, but we don't know why.
Right. So there's a puzzle aspect, as there should be to any good thriller and suspense novel. Well, Jesse, tell us about your main character, Fenn Cooper.
Right.
You can also say the source of the name, because that's part of the fun of the book, and why you chose to have a journalist rather than a detective or a private eye, who are often the main characters in thriller and suspense novels. But you made a journalist, Fenn Cooper, be your protagonist. Tell us about your decision to make a journalist be your protagonist and crime solver.
Well, I thought about having Fenn actually start off as a private detective. Mm-hmm. But when I was looking at the kinds of stereotypes for detectives and PIs, they're very hard-boiled.
Yes.
And Fenn is a journalist, so he's a great listener, and he's very thoughtful, he's very philosophical, and he has to evolve. He has the toolkit to investigate through a journalist's eyes what's going on. But also his relationships with all the characters in the book are very different because of this kind of sensitive, emotional side of him. And we have to, in many books, we see an arc.
Yes.
So he starts off in one place, and we see him evolve into a different place, hopefully better.
Yeah. Well, and part of what's interesting about making him a journalist is that, he is following his curiosity. He's a professional, curious person. And you learn some things about a journalist and how they put a story together. And the challenge of trying to get people who aren't always open to being interviewed to open up to him. So that's part of what's interesting, too, from my perspective, having read the book, about having your main character be a journalist who does grow through some of the relationships that he forms in the novel over the course of it. So, yeah, good choice.
Well, what's
and a different choice.
What's interesting is that he's a freelance journalist. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a story that he thought was good, and his editor said no. And he's actually threatened by the editor that if you don't write a good story that knocks the ball out of the park, you may not be working for me anymore.
Yeah.
And so he's assigned to do this investigative reporting of a traveling circus and the people that are basically on the side shows. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so he's under pressure.
That adds pressure.
More pressure.
To it too.
Right.
Yeah.
So you've
which-
got one guy who's got issues with this contract that could get him into trouble,
Yeah.
and then Fenn has to knock the ball out of the park
Yeah.
to make sure he writes a good story.
Against some resistance from the people he wants to interview.
Right.
Well, the title is A Fenn Cooper Novel, and that suggested to me there might be a hint there. It's not just Fenn Cooper novel; it's a Fenn Cooper novel. So, do you have a series of books in mind, Jesse? with
Well, I
Fenn
do.
Cooper?
I do. So this is the setup for the contract is the setup for the book, and the characters are both good and bad, like you find in most mysteries, and these stories have to be resolved by the end of the book, and hopefully readers will want to see how it plays out. And I left I left enough hooks in there so that it doesn't have like this, everything is resolved at the end. We still have, some bad guys, so to speak, that are lurking, and hopefully, in the next book, we'll see where they fit in and how that affects Fenn.
There has to be a little bit of a cliffhanger at the end of a series book, and it's it's a setup as you become fond of the characters, and I did become fond of Fenn. You kind of don't want to say a complete goodbye to them at the end. Right. You want to think they'll live on, and also Fenn does grow over the course of the novel, and it makes you feel curious about, well, where does he go from here? How does he develop as a journalist and as a person and in relationships? So. Well, Jesse, you've written that Paper Ghosts was inspired by events from your own life.
Right.
Please tell us how your childhood friendships with a little person impacted you, and how you hope that your inclusion of Zena, a little person with a huge personality, will affect readers.
So I have a couple of answers to that question. One is I did grow up with a little person, and I saw the world through his eyes. Mm-hmm. And what was sad was that, this is when I was in school, and nobody invited him to parties.
Oh.
He was really, kind
Left
of
out.
rejected,
Yeah.
left out of social things. And unfortunately, he was angry a lot. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really understand the anger until basically I started working on this book, or was more thoughtful about why would I include a little person as a main character. And one of the reasons I did that was I think that little people are underrepresented in books and even in movies, mm-hmm. or if they're represented, they're created as caricatures. Mm-hmm. And Peter Dinklage, who a lot of people know through Game of Thrones, did an interview, and he's very adamant about roles where little people are included that make them look like caricatures.
Yeah.
And he refuses to be part of that.
Yeah, good for him.
And so I wanted Zena to be, a main character who's a little person, and try to have the reader see her challenges mm-hmm. as a little person, how the world regards her, and mm-hmm. how she regards the so-called standard issue, normal-sized people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm glad you did, because it adds to their representation in a very mainstream kind of genre. And, when I initially read about that aspect of your own life and your decision to include a little person as a major character in your book, I thought, I can't think of any novels. I knew Peter Dinklage and his work, of course, but I really couldn't think of other actors.
Right.
I don't remember her name, but there was an actress who used to appear frequently on NCIS as a researcher and a lab assistant, and was a vivid character. But I couldn't think of novels. And so, well done.
Thank you.
And you're very, your book, the character that you've created, Zena, who's very vivid, and very just an interesting human being, but she's also very eloquent about how she's been treated over
Yeah.
the course of her life. It tells a very sad story about her, her early life being abandoned. And so she manages to communicate both the anger that any of us would feel about being perceived primarily as a curiosity,
Right. Yeah.
and dehumanized to that extent. But also she creates an enormous compassion. But she's also really interesting as a human being, and so Jesse, I'm appreciative of what you did with her character.
Yeah. The other thing that was a challenge was her relationship to Fenn
Yes.
and how that evolves.
Yeah.
Because they become closer and closer as the book evolves.
Yeah.
And we see, they both struggle with having a relationship.
Yeah.
And, for many reasons, some of them
Yeah.
obvious and some of them, not so
Yeah,
obvious.
and that's one of the really interesting forms of growth that I think Fenn goes through, because he starts out kind of having many of the stereotypes, but he's observant. He's a self-reflective person rather than a hard-boiled person.
Right.
That's another benefit to having a journalist be your protagonist. And so he's very aware of some of the kind of automated prejudiced expectations and responses, but he's working hard to be self-aware and to work them through. So anyway, it's one of the really interesting and unusual aspects of your book.
I think what's interesting also is that that Xena obviously feels like an outsider.
Yeah.
And so does Fenn in his own way. And I think a lot of people, whether you're a little person or not, can feel like an outsider
Yes.
at times. And
Yeah.
so I think, that's an interesting parallel for both
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, another experience you had that's different from many, if not most of us, is that you worked with a traveling circus yourself in the
That's right.
past. Yeah, with a traveling circus that had a midway with sideshows. So please tell us, Jesse, about the jobs you had on these and what you learned about the performers who became your friends and the audiences that were drawn to the sideshows, how the performers felt about them, and then how these learnings made their way into your book, Paper Ghosts.
So when I was working at this traveling circus and carnival, they had a lot of rides. And I studied art when I was in college. And my job was to paint very strange faces and creatures on the sides of some of the like Ferris wheels and
That sounds like
rides.
fun.
But since I spent a summer doing that, I also got to know the people on the sideshows.
Yeah.
And, they used to be called freak shows.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
And Barnum and Bailey, very famous, had, but those freak shows really focused on people with physical deformities,
Yeah.
Which was sad, but, people wanted to see oddities.
I mean, I think of the bearded lady.
Right, the
classically.
bearded lady, the
That's-
tattooed
yeah,
lady,
yeah.
the fat man,
Yeah.
So getting to know them was interesting because they live in a very different world. Many of them are, like Xena, are outsiders. They're not accepted by, the real world. And so the carnival becomes kind of a safe place for them, even though they're getting paid for people to look at them
Yeah.
because of their oddity. And so there are characters in this book that, that talk about what they do
Yeah.
for performance's sake. And one particular character we see, he's a PTSD veteran from Vietnam who has an act that inflicts pain on himself because of things he imagined he did when he was over there. And he's not quite sure what he did, but it's something that it's like a nightmare for him, ongoing. And how does he deal with that? How can he, come to terms with that? And we see that through the novel.
Yeah. Yeah, is a very poignant character.
Yes.
Because he lives with this guilt that it turns out was manufactured by an awful person.
Right.
But there have to be awful people in thrillers and suspense novels, or there has to be conflict. But it's very poignant.
And I did have a friend who served over there, And he did come back with a lot of post-traumatic stress symptoms.
Yeah.
So not as extreme as Holy John, who's the character we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot about his re-entry into civilian life, and I used some of that to develop Holy John's character.
The other thing that struck me about the performers was the way that they form a kind of a family of outsiders amongst themselves. So there may be outsiders to everybody visiting the circus, but amongst themselves, they're a united family, not in opposition so much, but in kind of a shared sense of being outsiders, not accepted by the world outside them, but together they form a unity. And like Zena and Holy John, the character you were talking about, are they form a team.
Right.
They both kind of fill needs that the other has. Zena has this almost uncanny, insightful ability, intuitive ability to read other people. In theory, she's a fortune teller, but she's really just a really, really acute observer with a lot of intuition, and Holy John is her protector. And so that was an interesting aspect to me of your book, to see that kind of alliance that had formed within the band of so-called outsiders. Right. They're the insiders. Which is just interesting to reflect upon about the world we live in, and we all do that, I think, in different ways. And
she protects him as well.
She absolutely does.
And what's interesting, some of her insightfulness is because when she actually was in college, she studied psychology,
yes.
But people would not take her seriously, because of the fact that she was a little person. Right. And purely by accident, she goes to this traveling circus and sees a band of little people performing. And all of a sudden, she's like, oh, these are my people.
Right. Right.
And they take her in, and so she starts, in a career that combines her psychological insights with so-called fortune telling, which is really, she's not really telling she's just listening.
She's just listening. She's paying attention.
Right.
Which is a large part of what therapists do.
Right.
Having been one.
And I'm married to one, so.
And
Yeah, I'm the patient that still has a lot of work to do.
Oh, we all do. We're all works in progress.
Right,
Jesse.
exactly.
But that's part of what's interesting, too, because there are scenes where it becomes clear to you just how insightful she is and that she's really helping people. She really has kind of a mission inside this circus world. She's really providing a great service to the people who come and enjoy being listened to, because being listened to can be a strangely rare experience in life.
But the other thing is, it's like there's a movie I think called Strangers or on a Train. But anyway, it's so easy to speak to a stranger about your issues and not your friends, because they're not going to pass judgments per se.
And you may never see them again.
You may never see them, which is safe.
You can tell them the truth.
Right, and Zena will give them, appropriate advice.
Yeah. So, well, Jesse, your book also takes us into parallel timelines, including a chapter of film history that I had no idea existed, the silent movie era, and the production of such films not in Hollywood, as we all picture and assume, but in Ithaca, New York. Please tell us how this surprising but real hub of silent filmmaking came to be, and what intrigues you about it that led you to want to include it as part of the Paper Ghost plot of your book.
Well, the contract is written during that silent movie time, so you see how that fits into the story. But when I was in college, I studied film history, and what was intriguing about silent movies is that they were not shot, as you said, in Hollywood. There were places all over the country. Ithaca, New York had a big production, so that's a real thing. But they were Paterson, New Jersey, Chicago, even in the boonies, Kansas. People loved to go to the movies. It was, a fabulous thing. So I was intrigued by using that as a setup.
Yeah.
And also because the contract is created between two silent movie producers, one who wants to get out of the business and one that wants to go west. And why did people then begin to migrate to Los Angeles and Burbank and Hollywood? Well, one reason was the weather.
Yes.
It was very hard to shoot, anything in the winter.
Yeah.
And so, there was this, mecca out there in the West where you had sunshine and you could shoot, in the mountains. You had snow if you wanted. So, that was the impetus for people to move out there. The other thing that was interesting about how silent movies evolved, and what were the disruptions? What was the disruptions that caused them to not just move out west because of weather, but there was all of a sudden the talkies came into play.
Yeah.
Because before silent movies, they had captions on the bottom, and sometimes they even had a piano player in the movie theater, kind of giving the scene some emphasis. When talkies came into play, a lot of the actors had terrible voices, and their careers cratered because of that. And so Fenn, not Fenn, but I'm blanking on Pink is the guy. He realized that he's had enough.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of scandals. There's a wonderful book called Hollywood Babylon, which talks about all the scandals that went on during the silent movie era. There was sex, there was drugs, there was murders, a lot of things that happen today in modern day, entertainment in Hollywood. But anyway, I was fascinated by this evolution of actors and what they had to do, which was a term they coined, which was they had to mug to the camera, meaning that if there was some kind of emotion, they had to exaggerate their facial expressions, they had to exaggerate their physical expressions. And then, with talkies, they didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
They still had to use their face, but not wildly like they did in the silent movies.
Well, of course, I think of Singing in the Rain, where that theme of, what's going to happen now that, the silent, that we have to talk, and I think maybe the prominence of Singing in the Rain may be why people think they all took place in Hollywood and why that chapter of them being dispersed around the country disappeared. You're talking about the scandals. It reminds me of one of my favorite descriptions in your book. It's near the beginning, if I remember it correctly. You talk about the Hollywood movie business and all the scandals as being like, I think it's hell covered with pixie dust.
Right.
Which I just thought was charming. It stayed with me, as you can see.
Thank you.
Well, Jesse, I wanted to ask you, now you're an independent and indie author, as they say, and, having a book published is a dream for many, many people who have a novel in their back pocket. You made it happen. So I was hoping that you could talk to us about the opportunities and the challenges that you've encountered as an independent author, and any advice that you might have for aspiring authors who want to take that novel out of their back pocket and see it in a bookstore.
That's a great question. Traditional publishers usually find authors through an agent. So a challenge for any author who is not represented by an agent or by a publisher is to try to get certainly an agent's attention. So agents, you can't send books in directly to publishers now. I mean,
they're the gatekeepers.
So the agent, when they recommend a book to a publisher, they, depending on their creds, their credibility, if they have good creds, then a publisher or somebody that works with a publisher will look at the manuscript and then decide for themselves whether it's worth pursuing. So if you're a beginner, one of the challenges, well, how do you get eyes on your manuscript? How do you find the right agent? And so the whole idea of writing a query letter to an agent becomes very essential. And if you don't grab their attention with that letter, you've got to move on. And I know that there's some authors that have written hundreds of query letters before they get somebody to bite.
Yeah.
So if you're, if you run out of patience
Yeah.
and you get enough rejections and you still want your book to get out there, the next alternative is to self-publish.
Yeah.
And that's what an indie author is. They self-publish. And so that becomes a challenge as well, because there are probably 1 million new books published every year.
I saw that statistic and something you sent me.
Yeah.
That's jaw-dropping.
And there's like 4 million self-published books
Wow.
a year. So, you're, as an author, whether you're, represented or not, that's a challenge.
It's huge. Yeah, it's huge.
How do you,
Yeah.
how do you find eyeballs? How do you find
Yeah.
people that are interested in what you're doing, right? And so the difference with a published author is that they get money up front. Okay?
Yeah, an advance.
And they get an advance.
Yeah.
And any royalties go towards that advance. And then once that is paid off, then there's more money in their pocket. Also, the publisher, if there's enough interest, will renew. Well, they'll be interested in the next book.
Yes, right.
But with an indie author, you don't have an advance. Everything is coming out of your own pocket.
You have to invest in it yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is, okay, I'm tired of sending out query letters and getting rejected and not getting people's attention. So the next step is, all right, how do I find a self-publishing publishing house?
Yeah.
Okay. And the challenge for that is, how do you pick the right one?
Yeah.
Because you can pay from $500 to $5,000 to get your book done. And depending on their services, like they will offer you editing, they will design your book cover, they will do proofreading. The only thing that they do in terms of marketing is send out a press release.
Yeah.
And then the rest is up to you.
Yeah.
So then you've got to figure out, okay, what does social media, how can I get social media to be interested? Because that,
Yeah.
You can get, Facebook and Instagram and all these other social media platforms. And so along with the expense of paying for the publisher, then you have to invest in building a website and maybe hiring a social media manager to help you, get more eyeballs on your book. And, Amazon has its own ranking system.
Yeah.
And, it's complicated. So, my advice to any independent author is that most likely you're not going to sell more than 250 books. That's the statistic. You could be, it could be more, certainly. But the other thing is that you have to do it because you like to write. And I'll use Confucius as an example. He says, do what you love and love what you do.
Absolutely.
And that's so
Right.
true.
Right.
Don't expect that you're going to become a best-selling author.
Yeah.
If you like to write, write. And if you want to invest money and time in self-publishing, it's a risk. You're rolling the dice. But, at least your book is out there.
And at least it gives you, you can have some control over the process rather than waiting and getting rejection letter after rejection letter. There's something you can do. You just need to be prepared and realistic, I think is what you're saying,
Right.
about what you'll be investing yourself in terms of finances, and also developing some expertise in a lot of things that a traditional publisher would have done in the past for an author. Learn a little bit about marketing, learn about social media, which could be interesting for some people, but it's good to be aware that these are things you're probably going to have to do for yourself.
Even traditional authors, if they're not, bestsellers,
Yeah.
they have to do their own marketing. They have to, attend book clubs
Right.
and signings at libraries and going to bookstores like I did. And so it's, unless they're, a Grisham or, Ken Follett or Louise
Right.
Penny,
Right.
they have to do the work themselves as well.
A lot of legwork.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not just,
Yeah.
okay, my book is out there, I got paid, how do I
Yeah.
get more sales? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jesse. That's interesting. That's
Yeah.
helpful. Well, I know that you are a fan of the mystery thriller because you've described Paper Ghosts as a love letter to the genre. So I have to ask, are there particular authors whose work influenced you in Paper Ghosts, and which kind of masters of the genre are your all-time favorites?
Well, there's so many out there. There really are. James Lee Burke is one of my favorites. He uses a technique which I use in my book, where whenever my main character, Fenn, is in a chapter, it's first person. So you see everything through his eyes.
Yeah.
When he's not in the chapter, it's third person. And so that's a technique that a few authors have used, which I thought was interesting, because I started, I didn't know whether I should do everything in first person or third person. And I said, well, maybe I could do both. So some of my favorite authors. Okay, Louise Penny. Agatha.
I love Louise Penny. I read everything she's written.
She's great.
She's great.
Agatha Christie, of course, is like, the premier of mysteries. I wrote down a few things before I came here. Let me find the right page. Here we go. Raymond Chandler. Now, these are old-time people.
Classics.
Classics. Michael Connelly is also great. I mentioned Agatha Christie, Dashiell Hammett, again, old-fashioned, but, some of these are very period pieces, and some of them are more modern. And there's one woman, Claudia Piero, whose heroine is a reporter.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with her.
Yeah, so...
I'll have to check her out.
I'll give you her name, and
great.
you can
Wonderful.
look her up.
Yeah, great.
So, but there's so many out there,
There are. Well, I know that you had a reading at Jabberwocky the beginning of October, and I was curious, were there questions that you received from the audience that you found most intriguing to think about and answer?
That's a great question. I think one thing that came up at that book reading at Jabberwocky was character development. Okay, so when I wrote Paper Ghosts, I had a general idea of how I wanted to create the book, and I don't remember it. It might have been, I can't remember the author that said this, but he said there's some authors that they're like engineers, they scope out every chapter, they know this goes to this, next. And then there are other authors that are like gardeners, and they plant seeds and they see how they grow. And I think I did a little bit of both. Okay, so when you start to write a character, you have to be open that they will change. And they will change in relationship to the other characters in the book, And I think, I drew from my own experiences, as we talked about before, about my friendship with the little person, and also the fact that I worked in the carnival. So I'm using my own experiences. I think you also can learn from other books and other movies and plays in terms of watching how characters interact and how they evolve. And I think that it's like creating a sculpture out of clay, which is very malleable. And so you can make mistakes, and you can go back and correct them, right? That if you're carving something in marble,
No, right.
you can't make a mistake. You gotta, So I think character development is always going to be a challenge. How do you make people feel? How do you make them three-dimensional? Which is instead of flat and two-dimensional. So I personally think I did a fairly good job.
I agree.
With developing believable three-dimensional characters. And I think the best books you really feel that person, whoever it is, whether they're good or bad or whatever, that they're believable.
Yeah. I think of the character of Gamache in Louise Penny's novel,
Mm-hmm.
and he's a vivid presence to me. He's like living in a parallel universe, you know, and yet he grows. In each book, he changes. He has conflicts. He has to rise to challenges. Anyway, so that's really interesting. Thank you, Jesse. Well,
Yeah.
Jesse, final, most important question: where can people get your book?
Well, I support my local bookstore.
Well, you should. They can be a dying breed. We need to keep them alive.
Exactly. And so I had a reading at Jabberwocky, and Sue Little is great.
We're so lucky to have Jabberwocky.
Very supportive. And so if you're local, go there. But of course, my book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, and if you're a Kindle lover, you can get it on Kindle as well. So,
which is what I did.
Okay.
Which is why I didn't have a copy to bring today. But it's funny, you know, when ebook readers first came out, Jesse, I'm never going to get one. Never, you know. I like a good solid book. I like to hold it in my hands. But somebody gave me one, and okay, that was the end. Because you can carry your whole library with you. And if you're traveling, sometimes you want a novel, sometimes you want a nonfiction book. A lot of the time you want a mystery, and they're all there in the same place. So.
And also, I think I don't have a Kindle, but from what I understand, you can go back to where you left off. Yeah. You can look up a word that you may not know. You know, so that's an advantage.
Yeah. You can make the typeface bigger
right.
for some of us of a certain age. That's a real benefit.
The other thing that has become very popular are audiobooks.
Yes. Yeah.
A lot of people don't like to read. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's tiring on their eyes if they've been sitting in front of a computer all day. But the challenge for me in terms of that is that's another investment.
That's right.
So, I didn't jump on the audio, although I would have loved to. But it's an expensive endeavor to get that done.
Well, maybe the day will come.
So. I hope so.
Well, Jesse, thank you so much. It's been so much fun to talk to you about Paper Ghosts and about books and character development and all of your interesting experiences that you folded into Paper Ghosts. Thank you so much for coming here today to talk about Paper Ghosts.
And thank you for having me, Mary.
It's been my pleasure. Well, I wish you all the best of success with Paper Ghosts, Jesse.
Thank you.
That's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well, read a mystery. Take care. Bye.
Bye.